We all know what it's like to have drawings that haven't turned out the way we hoped. What we don't always realise is that this situation sets us up for really noticeable drawing improvement if we handle it the right way. Because it's really only a problem if we can't work out why our drawings are not turning out. Let me illustrate 5 ways we can weaken our drawings' effectiveness. And for each of them, I'll show you the difference it makes when we get it right. Let's say we've just done this drawing and there are things about it that are working, but I can tell it's not looking right. One of the biggest problems we face is when our work simply isn't accurate. The subjects, the scene is inaccurate in a number of key ways. And the most obvious, particularly if we're drawing buildings, is perspective. And the difference between a drawing where we haven't focused in precisely enough on the perspective and one where we have is this. One of the most obvious things is that this angle is not steep enough. And it's these sharp angles that, in my mind, introduce a real sense of visual drama to what we're seeing. But it's more than that. This line has been drawn carelessly and doesn't slope up nearly enough, which lengthens the height of all the windows and doors, which means that now it's hard to draw figures correctly in proportion to the building because the proportions of these elements in the building don't match the overall perspective. But the foreshortening, the narrowing as things move further away from us, that means that objects the same size or the same distance apart seem to get narrower and closer together as they move away from us, hasn't been done properly here. Not enough careful observation and then plotting how to capture that careful observation. And so we've approximated the foreshortening, which has vastly changed the visual effect that we get in reality. If we look at the dome, we also see that in this less accurate one, these lines are curved approximately the same. But in reality, perspective theory tells us that as you move above eye level, curves for circular forms become rounder, more fuller as they move up or down away from eye level. And in life, that looks like this, where we have these curves getting slightly fuller as they move up above eye level, which is about here. Now, there is only one eye level for any given scene. Another very common problem is multiple eye levels. And in this outline of that building, there's an eye level at this level, there's going to be one higher up at this level, and there's going to be another one higher up again, way off on the right-hand side. And the proportions of the windows are forced to change as they move away from us. And that's because our eye level hasn't been kept in control. The difference between an inaccurate version and an accurate version of the same thing that has one consistent eye level is the difference between something that leaves us feeling a bit uneasy and something where we don't even think about perspective because it just looks right. The problem with getting the underlying perspective wrong, in this case the foreshortening, the compression, hasn't happened accurately, and so we go from rectangular windows to square windows because we're distorting the shape of the building, is the difference between this and this. And the problem is that if we do an outline that's not accurate enough, we can then put a lot of time and effort and do a good job of adding detail now, but it's still always going to look fundamentally flawed because the skeleton of the building is flawed. If we have accuracy problems, we need to look at perspective theory enough to work out what's not working in my drawing. The second area of weakness we might find in our drawings is a cartoon-like effect that comes from an overemphasis of heavy outline. If not heavy, at least basically the same type of outline going around all the objects that we have. It creates a cartoon-like effect, an unrealistic effect, because, well, this is the way cartoons are drawn, with a heavy outline around the shapes. But in life or in a photo, that's not the effect we get. Not every edge looks the same. The difference between getting this wrong, even when our scene is accurate, and getting it right, is more like this, where there's great variety in the marks that we've used. And I've been thinking marks instead of lines, because lines don't really capture this scene as visually effectively as marks do. Instead of an outline around the roof, a series of dots and dashes leaving clear space in between captures more the feel, the visual effect of the thatched roof. If we look at this hedge, this solid squiggly line here does not really capture the effect of the serrated edges of leaves catching the light, as well as the marks I've used. This is such a common way of outlining foliage of almost any type. But again, we can get a more accurate look by using a series of marks that capture not just the sort of tree, the sorts of leaves on the tree, the way the leaves hang, but also what color the leaves are and how far away from us they are. A very helpful exercise is to experiment with marks for different types of foliage seen at different distances to see what marks we can use and how we can combine them to give a sense of different foliage of different trees at different distances. And we need to do this from a reference. We're not making it up in our heads. It's much easier to copy what's real. Now, it's not saying that unhelpful line work means the drawing's inaccurate or it's not well done or there's not a lot of detail. It doesn't mean an oversimplification. But when all our lines are very heavy and very much the same, we get a very different feel to when we use more variation in the weight of our lines. There is more to a good drawing than accuracy in perspective and proportion. It's also putting marks on the paper that capture something of the different materials that different objects have. Resisting the urge to do an outside edge to our foliage creates the opportunity to use marks which, taken together, feel a whole lot more realistic. Even drawing from one side of a post to another, using perhaps a lighter line where the sun is hitting and a darker line where there's shadow, but also greatly varying the weight of the line we've used for things such as this grass and the way we've drawn the lines. Once I've decided that my drawings have a cartoon-like feel to them that I don't like, I can start to work out exactly what elements that I'm drawing are causing the problem. And I can work on finding marks, outlines, and edges for those elements. I can also look at the work of artists whose work inspires me and has some overlap with what I'm trying to do to see how do they draw these same things in a way that escapes that cartoon-like effect. The third area of weakness, and this isn't an inaccuracy, but it's more a lack of something, and that's when our scene is accurate, the proportions are correct, or they're correct enough, and my marks are happier, they're not heavy outlines, but there's some element that just, I don't know, makes our scene look a bit boring. And so often, in my experience, the problem is a lack of values. Now, values are lights and darks. If they're too much the same, the overall effect can be confusing or at least boring. Look at the difference between this drawing and this one. Visually, which is the more compelling to look at, which has a stronger sense of drama? I think overwhelmingly this one. And in the end, it's simply that I spent more time creating darker values behind to create a stronger contrast between the dark foliage behind and the white of the columns and the lighter overall effect of the architecture. A tree drawing that has some things that I think are okay in it, but overall, it's even a bit hard to know at first what it is or what's happening because there's too much mid-value that I've created by marks and hatching that all look the same. Perhaps not quite as bad as this, but with a similar outcome is this bush scene where there's still a lot of sameness of value. In this case, a lot more lighter values spread across the whole scene. This is almost like an abstract pattern. But when we work at identifying the values in our reference or the values that our drawing needs, means we can go from drawings that end up looking as these and get far more dramatic and, can I say, clearer to understand drawings. This is probably, in terms of value contrast, my strongest contrast drawing that I've done, and it's no coincidence that it's also one of my favorites. What could have been a very, very confusing scene to draw with an ink line, I think is very easy to read, very easy to understand when we see it, what's happening. And the light and the dark really draw us into the scene, I think, in a very compelling way. When we learn to go really dark with our darks and to preserve really light lights, we open up the way to bring great clarity into something which otherwise to look at would be very much the same to the point of confusion. By controlling our values, we can also add a tremendous sense of three dimensions to what we've drawn, of closer and further. Sometimes we just need boldness to push dark in our values, particularly when it's a scene that we've invested a lot of time and effort into drawing accurately, getting the proportions correct, getting our line work with variation and interest. We can simply be too timid to go as dark as we need to go to really capture the strongest impact that the scene can give us. This next common area of weakness is particularly easy to fall into if we draw a lot from photos, and that's to have line work that captures accurately what we're looking at, the proportions, the shapes, but that ends up looking very flat, very two-dimensional. We know from the forms and the foreshortening that this is curving away from us, and yet it still looks really quite flat. And again, this is related to our line work and to keeping our line work all the same. Instead of controlling it in a way to create the effect of distance. And this can mean the difference between a fairly flat, boring drawing and one that has a much stronger sense of three-dimensional reality. There's a lot more variation in my marks here than we have here. I've gone darker and stronger in this closer section of this corner building, and that helps it to pop just a little bit closer than what's on either side. And as we curve away, my line work correspondingly lightens, along with some other changes to create the effect of distance. Here's a drawing that I did before I began to pay attention to the heaviness, the evenness of my lines, before I began to manipulate my line work more to create the effect of distance. Now, this is an accurate scene for perspective and so forth, and it's very detailed, but in the end, it has a flatter, more two-dimensional look for all the detail and the perspective accuracy than compared to this drawing, which I did after I'd been working on adapting my line work to create a sense of distance. Controlling our line work can be used to incredible effects that, because they create a sense of realism, make our drawings far more interesting and engaging. And that's to use patterns to stand in place of things that are perhaps a bit difficult or complex or confusing or simply too time-consuming to draw. So for this tree up here, I often see things that look more like this, where an approximate pattern has been drawn to represent the more realistic effect that we have when we look at this sort of plant. It's the same with smaller leafed plants. Instead of trying to work out how to capture the effect of all these leaves, we have a silhouette line being added, and then we have a pattern that in some way for us, we're trying to create the effect of the leaves, because we know all these leaves are here, so we feel obliged to do something to draw them, but we're overwhelmed with how many there are, and so we end up with a pattern. And let's face it, we see this so often, we know it's foliage. We see the same thing with brickwork. And we think we've drawn the brickwork realistically, but in fact, we've drawn a pattern because When we look at the wall, we can see that the scale is wrong, the proportions of the bricks are wrong, the foreshortening as the wall moves away from us is wrong, and now we don't so much see the wall as a whole, which is what we see in life, but we see this pattern that really draws the eye, especially if there's a heavy outline around it. When it comes to grass, instead of looking at the effect of the grass that we have in the scene with the distance it is from us and the way that's lit up with where the sun is, we start without thinking to do grass patterns that usually link back to grass patterns in cartoons we've seen. And even if we make them smaller as they go further back, it's not nearly enough for the foreshortening that's taking place on the horizontal rather than the vertical surface. Patterns tend to get used whenever we have detail of what feels like overwhelming complexity. And so we end up using patterns or symbols, which also can be drawn more easily with lines, than trying to find marks that will in some way create the effect of what we see in the right proportion for how strongly we see it in the reference. Because part of reality is that we don't see every detail with the same emphasis, the same strength all at once. We end up focusing on some things, more important elements. We certainly wouldn't see this brick wall in life before we see this gate, the steps leading up to it. But I've seen many walls on the sides of drawings where there's so much brickwork drawn in such a heavy-handed way that not just is it the first thing we see, it's almost the only thing we see. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. There's nothing wrong with creating drawings that don't work for us the way we'd hoped. This is part of learning. If we learn the piano, we're going to hit some wrong keys. But it's so productive to learn to identify the issues that we are unhappy about in our drawing and use them to direct us to where we need to improve our understanding or our process or techniques in drawing in order to start to get drawings we are happy with. Drawing problems are our friends. They point us into the direction we need to put more attention. I hope this discussion will give you some clues as to where you can not just identify problems, but also solutions for those problems. But in the end, whatever drawing you do, however you do it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.